that we are going to be having. No, chat too, so I can see it if people put it. The discussions that we hear about the perspective of Israel and Israelis are often very one note for obvious reasons, I think. And I thought it was really important to bring to our community a diversity of Israeli opinions, a diversity of the discourse that is happening in Israel, and just a sense of how different the conversation is over there. So normally, Ezra, I would say over there, but you are not, in fact, over there right now. Will you share with everyone where you are?
So I'm currently in England, just outside of London, at Sadeh Farm. It is a Jewish farm and retreat center that I'm doing a independent fellowship on, doing some tech study, doing some organic farming. It's just been really lovely with some amazing people.
So you spent, well, first of all, you were the front desk person at CRC, amongst other titles that you had in your tenure here.
Yep.
You came to Judaism, you came to Jewish community at CRC. What has this year been? What have you been doing? Will you share with everyone about your program?
So this year I've been at Paradise Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, which understands itself as a yeshiva program. So that means that we are in class all day, every day, learning Torah. We have our Chumash. My class has been learning Exodus. We've also been getting into some Gemara, and then some more like topical issues like sexuality and sanctity, women in halacha. It's a progressive, coeducational, queer, inclusive institution.
So you've been studying there for a year, quite a year for you to be there. Take us back to the immediate aftermath of October 7th and your decision to leave or to stay. Will you talk us through that for a moment?
Definitely. So when October 7th happened, I was actually up in Spot on a retreat. Um, and getting back amongst everything was a difficult decision. The decision to even like come back to Jerusalem was tricky, and like understanding things through a lot of like misinformation and confusion of unverified Instagram accounts that a lot of people were listening to was incredibly difficult. It was hectic. Getting back to yeshiva was a little dicey. A lot of people did make the decision to leave. I was definitely thinking about it. I was calling Daniel very panicked. And I think what really sold it is Daniel reminded me how much more likely it was that I was going to get shot in St. Louis than killed by a missile in Jerusalem, which by the numbers, absolutely true. I live
That's what I
in
told my
Georgia.
mother when I went in November. Yeah, exactly. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so that was, we had some people that went over to Europe just to kind of like wait it out to see how things went. And then about, I want to say a month in, they decided that we weren't going to do Zoom classes anymore. People were either going to come back or they were going to leave, and they had to make that choice. So mostly what happened is the people who were fresh out of college had their, parents book them a ticket home because the parents were not having it. So our cohort has been a little bit older this year than in past years. Um, and then the yeshiva pretty much immediately jumped into action doing supply drives for the IDF, which I have some feelings about. Um, it's kind of a lot of it was focused on, you know, supporting the IDF, supporting the troops, which, as somebody who grew up, 2005 American troop worship, um, hit on some notes that I did not like. But it was also difficult having that kind of like ingrained in me, and also having a very real threat that I was in fact protected against, while still being against, like broadly, I would say that I'm against the IDF and what they do in the day to day. So that's been complicated and difficult. And I think most of my classmates swung further to the right. I kind of, at the time that this happened, I would have defined myself as a liberal Zionist. And I kind of didn't know which way to jump for a while. And definitely jumped back into being a leftist because I was, very involved in like anarchist, communist organizing back in college. So I definitely jumped a different direction than most of my classmates.
So I know it's hard for you to compare the American response to October 7th and this ongoing war to the Israeli one because you have not really been in America. Though I think you probably see things and talk to folks. Uh, can you take us through what are the dividing lines in Israeli society right now when it concerns this war, when it concerns the hostages? And of course, we're here just a day after four hostages were rescued and released in an operation that killed many Palestinians. Uh, so would very much like to hear your thoughts on what the Israeli dividing lines in politics, tribes, political conversations are right now. And maybe just as a prompt, I think one of the interesting things for me has been that bring them home, right? The chant, the slogan for the hostages who have been captured that, as I understand it, bring them home is generally a pretty right-wing slogan in the United States and is generally a pretty left-wing chant in Israel. And I don't know if that's where you want to start or not, but let me turn this over to you, Ezra, please.
It's tricky because I am firmly in the like Anglo English speaking bubble because I do not speak Hebrew unless
You
we want to go
better
to
you better
British
translate that
Anglo.
word Anglo for people who aren't
Oh,
familiar.
the like British American bubble of people who primarily speak English and primarily socialize in English.
Hey, there are
So
Canadians and Australians who are quite upset at you
also
leaving.
Canadians and Australians. I forget about them sometimes, but they do exist. Um, but so I'm not like as exposed to, Hebrew speaking Israeli life as other people, but within our bubble, the bring them home has definitely been it's moved. So bring them home was originally it's not quite the right word. It's kind of run the gamut. You have some people saying bring them home in the total victory sense, with the idea that we're going to defeat Hamas completely, which is an insane statement, um, and bring them home that way. And then we have people who are saying that we need a hostage deal, we need a ceasefire, bring them home that way. So if I hear somebody say bring them home, I really don't know where they're at. But increasingly, the anti-war protesters and the um, like I say, so there are these tents with hostage posters where people have mincha, they have prayer services, they have protests
Hold on,
scattered
we
throughout.
better pause you here because
Oh, what's
tense dealing with the war in Gaza has a very different immediate connotation here. So will you give us an image of where these are, what they are? I might even have some pictures from November I can pull up.
that? Okay. So they're kind of like they range from like farmers market type stall things to like wedding event tents that are primarily like centers of gathering for people who are in some way connected to the hostages or are involved in activism advocating for their release, usually through ceasefire and hostage deal. These are on kind of street corners in Israel. They're lined with a hostage poster, as most of Jerusalem is right now. Um, and I'm not quite sure how to contrast it because what are you thinking of when you say tents and Gaza war?
So here in the US, I think tents dealing with the war bring images of anti-war protests on campuses. And uh,
Oh, different tents.
yeah, which is just a very different context. So keep going with this, and then I want to talk to you about anti-war movements. But keep going. You were bringing up the tents for a reason, and I'll have pictures by the time you're done.
Definitely. So these have been largely kind of, I would say, more on the right for a while. Of course, I would describe most of Israeli society as more toward the right. Um, and it's, I think, become increasingly clear that the way to bring people home is through ceasefire and is going to be through, ideally, anti-war protesting. So the anti-war demonstrations have gotten larger. They've moved charged with a lot more like normalized, bring them home. And so these demonstrations that my like very left wing friends and people that I socialize with have been a part of for a long time now have a lot more people. It's a lot more normalized, which results in a lot less police violence. So if you have a small group of leftists, the cops will beat the crap out of you. If you have, somebody's mom and everybody's mom, people are a little bit less wanting to see them beat up in the media. So things have gotten safer. The tone has definitely changed in the anti-war protests.
So that's what I'd love to hear some talk about too. The anti-war movement, or perhaps the lack of an anti-war movement, or my impression now, when I was there in November, that's a very long time ago for this war, very clearly. But there was no meaningful anti-war movement when I was there in November. When I have spoken to friends, including yourself, over these last few months, there's been talk of small and emerging anti-war movements, but by and large, my understanding has been actually that up to very recently, and maybe it's changing, would love to hear your thoughts, but up to very recently, that there is not an anti-war movement in Israel, has not been one like we've seen in the United States. That instead there is a right-wing movement to prosecute this war in a pretty brutal way, and there is a left-wing movement or centrist movement to prioritize the hostages and getting them released, but that there has not been much of a true anti-war discourse. And would love to hear your thoughts on that. Is that accurate? Is that changing? Yeah, please.
So yes and no. Like I definitely would not say that there's been an anti-war movement like there's been in the States. Students are not out protesting by and large. It's not nearly the same tone. There has been anti-war demonstrations this entire time, but the size and the like composition of who is there has changed. The like centrist focusing on the hostages has definitely moved toward that anti-war stance, and so I think that that's created a much larger mass movement, which I think is what we need to see here. So there have been weekly or twice weekly demonstrations for months on ends now, but they are larger and different
Uh, Thank you. Okay, I want to turn this conversation. A few weeks ago, we were speaking on the phone. You were on a TUL somewhere. And
now.
a TUL, by the way, for those who don't know, just means sort of a little mini vacation, a travel, is there a better word? Field trip? Uh,
Yeah, field trip. Usually like
yeah,
overnight field trip.
overnight field trip. Yeah, TUL has the feeling of overnight field trip. Yeah, there you go. Um, and Ezra, you told me that you were, and just said it in a nonchalant way. I don't even know if you remember what I'm about to say, but you said you were on a Zionist TUL.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm at a Zionist institution. It's on their website.
but so
We
it stunned me. I still remember when you said it because I hadn't heard the word Zionist used outside of a pejorative, negative context, or even used with the awareness that it was being used that way um, in months. And you used the word just as an offhand descriptor, an adjective about the sort of teal you were on. Uh, so will you define Zionism for us? And I'm going to ask all three of our guests
um
this. And I want to be clear, I'm not looking for an academic definition, really looking for your operating definition. And then maybe whether you consider yourself a Zionist.
so my definition of Zionist would be like belief or support of the existence of a Jewish state. A Jewish state meaning a state that is primarily Jewish, immigration only allowing Jews, and is not granting citizenship to Palestinians who do not currently have citizenship. Um, so the support of that is what I would define as Zionist.
And do you consider yourself a Zionist these days?
Definitely not.
So
Um,
it's really interesting to me, and I'd love for you to take that apart, that you live in Israel, you study at a Zionist institution, you are thinking about making Aliyah. And want to dig into that too a little bit, but and aren't using the word Zionist to describe yourself. So please.
So the main difference in that to me is that I believe that this is, what do I say? So a Jewish state to me means not granting citizenship to Palestinians. And I think that Palestinians should have full rights as citizens. Currently, they are subject to military law rather than civil law, which
You're talking about Palestinians in the West Bank now, correct?
in the West Bank, yes, thank you, um, are subject to military law, which also includes um, their living spaces being suddenly designated as military firing zones, and being required to leave, being terrorized by settlers who happen to be soldiers, and having that be put under the cover of military law. Um, I think that that is wrong and it is apartheid. And I think by definition, I cannot be somebody who believes in an exclusively Jewish state and believe in, the basic human rights that citizenship would afford Palestinians. So I choose citizenship and human rights.
How, so articulating a position like that in the United States as an American Jew would often be incredibly controversial, with many folks saying that views like that place you outside the bounds of acceptable Jewish opinions within community. Lots of effort to sort of draw those boundaries there. Uh, it's a different sort of thing when you are literally sitting in Israel, where when you uh, chose to stay post October 7th, when you've gone to bomb shelters however many times, when you've uh, so I'm wondering, how does a policy and position like you just articulated, how does it sit at Pardes, for example? And do you have any sense of how that is different, and how the diversity of acceptable opinions is different in Israel as opposed to back in the US?
So at Pardes, we definitely have a wide range of opinions. We have people who, like one of my teachers who was in full support of the Gaza war. A lot of my teachers have children in combat in Gaza. That makes conversations difficult. So you can't exactly accuse your teacher's child of being a war criminal. Conversations pretty much stop when that happens. So the bounds of discussion are different than the bounds of what is an acceptable opinion, because it's very much about time and place and relationships, because we are all stuck in this building together. Not stuck, that's not the nicest word. We are all choosing to be in this building together and we have to make it work. So there is an anti-Zionist student group that meets in the building. That was not always the case in prior years. They've been not allowed to meet in the building. There's been a lot more controversy around it. Now, Yasei Mishpat, our anti-Zionist student group, is a very normalized part of Pardes. Not everyone's favorite part of Pardes, but nobody's really minding that we exist right now.
And what does that mean? Because this is one of the lessons that I have learned. I've had all sorts of coffees with folks, Zionists, anti-Zionists, and one of the things I've learned is that these words do not mean the same thing to anyone but the person who's using them. So, right, like I think to many of us, it probably feels a little bit like an impossible kind of juxtaposition of words to say that you are in and part of an anti-Zionist group while you are choosing to live in Jerusalem after October 7th at a religious Zionist institution.
Yeah, it's so like I know that intellectually, and also it feels funny to me because like this is just like a normal life thing at this point for me. And so I think for a lot of us, many of the people in the group are required to do a year in Israel because of their rabbinical school. That's a big part of it. And then other people see um, or would like to see a future where Jews are, living in this place between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea alongside Palestinians. So us being here is not necessarily the contradiction that I feel a lot of people paint it as. We are just here. We just want more people to be able to be here.
Yeah, I always find that so interesting that the discourse here in the US is that, particularly within the Jewish community, is that anti-Zionism is an ideology that wants Jews to disappear from Israel. And certainly there are anti-Zionists, particularly in the United States, who that is their view. Uh,
Yeah,
but there's also a whole chunk of Jewish Israelis who use this term to describe themselves and mean something very different by it very
yeah,
clearly. Yeah, the
definitely.
language here is slippery.
Yeah, it's tricky. When somebody asks me whether I'm a Zionist, I definitely try to like get more information from them about how they're defining that term first, because my politics would be described by some as Zionist and by some as anti-Zionist. So I'm in this like funky gray zone for a lot of folks.
Uh, so in a moment, I would love to hear what it has been like just in general to be a queer person at Pardes in a sort of orthodox cultural space, even if it's a pluralistically orthodox cultural space. Uh, but first, what I'd really love to do is talk through this odd moment of Israel, Gaza, Palestinians, and queer identity in the US, where those things have really matched up with each other in some pretty powerful, meaningful ways for a lot of people. I know, but also a way that I think you, as a real life individual, sort of exist right at the crux of. Right? You are an openly queer person living in Jerusalem, being called a supporter of genocide while you are articulating a vision that you self-describe as anti-Zionist, which is just a situation I think that doesn't fit into hardly anyone's boxes. Uh, so first, we'd just love to hear personally how that's felt, what that has been like on both sides of the ocean, and then sort of more broadly, socially, sociologically, if you have thoughts too.
Definitely. It's kind of hard for me to gauge because I don't have like as much engagement with the United States left as I used to. On like literally October 7th, a lot of people who I had come to respect in organizing were literally celebrating the deaths and horrific atrocities against people who were at a festival that I very well could have been at. It's so I've cut a lot of ties. So I'm not as like tuned into these things. Um, and for me, living in Jerusalem right now, it's kind of difficult for me to talk about living at a contradiction when in day-to-day life it doesn't feel like one. Because I'm at Pardes, which is I would describe as queer inclusive. Has a ways to go before I would call it queer friendly, but there's progress being made. Um, and I say like one of my teachers does like queer NIDA consultancy. NIDA being the laws around menstruation. And she's very orthodox and also like certified by the Rabbanut to give the NIDA class that you're required to take before you get married in Israel. So a
Okay,
lot
hold
of us are
on.
walking on the edges.
I think we need to explain that a little bit because this is going to blow the mind of many American Jews who don't realize that actually of the countries with significant Jewish populations, Israel is the least religiously free for Jews of any of them. Right, Jews have less religious freedom in Israel than they do in the United States or Canada or Australia or England or Germany or and amongst these other restrictions is that the Rabbanut, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinic authorities, state authorities, actually control all life cycle. The most stark one to me is always that you'll have kids with a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother who moved from the Soviet Union who fight in the IDF, who die, who are killed in battle and who aren't allowed to be buried in a Jewish cemetery by the Rabbanut. So you have stark examples like that. But one of the most intrusive examples for everyday Israelis is, of course, that if you want to get married, it's got to be an ultra-Orthodox rabbi who does it if it's going to be official. And you have to take a class on Jewish menstrual purity, mikvah use, nida before you can get married, which is just wild, right? When you really pause and think about it. So sorry, I keep going.
Yeah, so it is incredibly wild, and it's wild to even like be like, pretty good friends. Like she is like my how do you say? Uh like the person that I check in with personally about how things are going at school. She's
Your
that person
mom.
to me, and she's dorm mom, yeah. And like she's certified by the rabbinute to teach this NIDA class, and also does queer NIDA consultancy, and teaches at Pardes, and teaches at a like gap year seminary for Orthodox girls. Like a lot of us are walking contradictions, and this is just kind of how we live our lives. So it's kind of difficult to talk about what it's like when it's just kind of like, I don't know, I wake up in the morning, I eat my cereal. Um, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, changing topics again. How do you understand anti-Semitism differently a year later?
Um, so I say, so coming from being at CRC on, being in the AV crew, and understanding the anti-Semitism that is kind of, directed very specifically at our services, and seeing, that was,
You
I
should
think it was
probably
like in
say
the
a
first.
couple words about this. I don't think most people know this. We keep it generally quieter.
Right. Okay. So one thing that was like pretty public, Daniel, do you remember? I think it was like in the like maybe second or third month that I had been volunteering at CRC, we had a essentially a coordinated attack of several different, like, I believe, bots through YouTube that were spamming the live stream of Friday night services with various anti-Semitic things. And the way that they do this is they create multiple accounts, so you can't block all of them. They use one per comment, and they set their message as their username so that even when you delete the comment, their username is still there, and their username is something horrific. Um, and um, Having that like those very direct issues, and also like working the front desk and getting some very strange to very like disturbingly anti-Semitic calls. It's been a very like direct experience. And then I kind of had a break from it in Israel. Like I was just kind of a Jew doing my thing. And then I came to England. And I had not been outside of Israel since I came here in August, since I came to Israel in August. And I really didn't know what I was going to find here, because I know some people are feeling less safe wearing their kippah. A lot of people are not feeling so safe wearing their Star of David. And it's always really hard to know from afar how like immediate and day to day these experiences are. So I definitely like went into that airport with like my seats tucked, my kippah under a hood, didn't know how it was going to go. And so this has definitely made me more scared of living outside of Israel, to be completely honest. Um, and haven't really, I definitely need to sit with that more and think about what that means for me and my life going forward. Because I've also just been like, I went through the London airport and now I'm in the middle of nowhere, um, with a bunch of Jews. and it's tricky.
What have the campus anti-war protests looked like from Israel, and how have Israeli media, Israelis at Pardes, Israelis around you, how have people understood and talked about these protests, or do they not impact, or
They're kind of one of a million things going on in the news. Like we kind of got bigger problems. Um, but when they do get talked about, it's usually in like when I'm having a conversation with somebody who's like not my anti-Zionist student group, who's not in my various organizing spaces, but just like random person at Pardes. It's the idea is a lot of like these students don't know what they're talking about. These are, you know, people who don't understand what it's like to live here. These are people who are anti-Semitic and we're looking for an excuse to hate Jews. And it's very difficult having the left defined to a lot of people as these, campus protests, when in fact, like, while I agree with a lot of the messaging there, these are in fact children with very simplistic understandings generally of how things work and what it is like to have a complex geopolitical reality. So I see them being used as like a straw man of the left a lot because, you know, people, there's going to be somebody uninformed at the protest who's going to have a mic shoved in their face and they're going to say something ridiculous. That's just a thing that happens because people want these people to look like fools. Um, and so having to kind of essentially defends the left while trying to have people keep in mind that these are children whose worldviews are still developing.
I I've been really surprised. I keep thinking about it by the number of Israeli friends and loved ones who have reached out to me to make sure that I'm okay because they're very concerned about the protests on campus.
Oh yeah, it looks way
And,
scarier for y'all from over here.
but it just, the idea of in a post-October 7th world having Israelis reach out to me because they're concerned about me with campus I keep thinking about this because I think it says something about the way that campus protests are being politicized in Israel and in the United States. We certainly see it right on every cable news program here. And actually, we had CRC college students at services a couple weeks ago and sat them down, and pretty universally, they all talked about how the outside energy and attention was much more dramatic and problematic than actually what was happening on campus. It was interesting because we had a whole range of students. We had students who were very involved in Hillel and Chabad pro-Israel activism on campus. We have a number of students who were a part of the protests themselves, and they all had relatively similar thoughts, which was really interesting about this. But it's been stunning to me to see the way that Israelis have really taken campus protests to heart. Um,
Yeah, because like definitely the way that it's talked about and portrayed is that these are anti-Semites, people who like don't understand and we're looking for an excuse to hate Jews. So people are seeing, especially Colombia, as a site of extreme anti-Semitism right now. People are assuming that Jewish students aren't safe on campus, um, especially with the recent like complaints that one particular student had that has led to a essentially escort system for Jewish students accessing Columbia's campus. Um, and so it's from here, it does look very scary. And also coming from a very like left-wing campus in the United States, I know things are always blown way out of proportion. Um, and so so I think that people's concerns around the campus protests have kind of been a like focal points around people's general concerns about anti-Semitism outside of Israel. It's just kind of the most visible, the most photogenic, for want of a better term, example that people can bring.
so turning the conversation again, Uh, while you've been studying at Pardes, you've spent a number of weekends out in the olive fields of Palestinian farmers. Can you talk about that experience, what it's been like? Um, just in both the why of it, why this is a program that is necessary, and sort of a personal reflection.
Okay. So I didn't quite make it in time for the olive harvest. I only started doing this work in about like late November. Um, but I go out primarily. Oh, there we go. Primarily in the Jordan Valley as a protective presence to essentially deter settler violence. Settlers prefer to commit their violence against Palestinians without
Say a little bit about
using
settler
family.
violence for those of us who are less familiar with that term and that idea.
But, okay. So I primarily work with Palestinian Bedouin communities who are in Area C. Um, and one of the things that happens is you
Sorry,
have.
you're gonna have to keep unpacking, Ezra. Area C.
Okay, so it is the area of the West Bank that is still the West Bank, but under complete Israeli military control. And that is the area that is subject to military law if you are a Palestinian, and subject to civil law if you are in Israel. Um, and there are some very normalized settlements that are essentially suburbs at this point. A lot of my teachers live in Gush Etzion, which is just a Jerusalem suburb at this point. And then you have people who are in Rimonim, which is a little bit deeper, a little bit more extreme. And then there are the outposts. Um, People build small, like even just like one or two building settlements that are even illegal by Israeli standards. All of this is illegal under international standards, by the way, all of these settlements. But under Israeli standards, even these outposts are illegal. Sometimes they're declared neighborhoods of existing settlements, despite being, tens of miles away. But they are usually, or their purpose is to push Palestinians off of their land. That is their stated purpose. The settlers there would agree with me on this,
I just want to
because
pause and
this.
give a plug that for our third Sunday, so 2 weeks from today, we are going to hear from someone who is the daughter of Moroccan refugees who had to flee the country and make their way to Israel, who has a master's degree in American liberal Judaism and who is a settler, lives in a settlement, even though I don't think that's how she would self-define. So I just want to give that plug that that's a voice we are going to hear as well and explore in a first person perspective. So keep going. Sorry, Ezra.
Definitely. And like when I say settler, that covers a very like broad range of even like political understandings. One of my teachers lives in Gush Etzion, is a settler, does not apologize for being a settler, and joins us to pack food for Bedouin Palestinian families in Area C. And then there's the people at the outposts who are very specifically doing this to push Palestinians out of their land. They push Palestinians off their grazing areas, primarily through threats of violence, stealing sheep, and they narrow and narrow the areas of land that Palestinians are able to graze on to the point where the cost of feed outweighs the like benefits of having livestock, and eventually their economic stability crumbles and they have to move to the cities is usually what happens when their villages are no longer viable. So that's one method. They also do like very literal pogroms against Palestinians. These are settlers who will come and blast music, bring people out of their beds at night, threaten violence. They will come into Palestinians' home, commit violence against them while filming it, and then turn in the portion of the footage that shows the Palestinian defending themselves. And then the Palestinian is arrested and jailed, sometimes indefinitely as a like security prisoner.
I I sort of think of them as Proud Boys, or what's the name of the group that patrols the southern border in Texas? I think of them as the
Yeah,
Israeli version of these groups, except they operate with perhaps even more than a wink and a nod of support from the government.
yeah. A lot of them are soldiers themselves. A lot of times, people who are settlers in the West Bank will be, go into the IDF and be assigned to the West Bank, and so they are essentially living their day-to-day lives, but with that added legitimacy. And I want to especially note here that the song Am Yisrael Chai is incredibly weaponized. That is what they blast at Palestinians while they are terrorizing them. Those are the signs that they put up around the West Bank, which is essentially saying Israelis are welcome here, Palestinians are not. So when you hear people's opposition to the use of the song Am Yisrael Chai, it is in direct response to that because the settlers have made it this symbol of Israeli supremacy.
I don't think that's made it over here yet. I mean, I'm sure it's being used in some jingoistic ways, but I don't think the association, at least for me, of Am Yisrael Chai to right-wing settler violence, that's not an association I have. It's really interesting. Um,
It's not necessarily an association that most Israelis are aware of because you just have someone in, Rehovot living their life who wouldn't know this, would not have a reason to know this. But this is something that I feel like more left-wing people are aware of as they kind of keep up with the goings on in the West Bank, and then people kind of don't understand their like negative reactions to this.
so you, in response to this, there are these organizations, and you've been going out to these fields. What is that experience like when you go out?
So I usually do overnight shifts. The first overnight shift I went on was specifically because some settlers had come and like torn down one of the Palestinians' homes, kind of usual day-to-day stuff. And they had gotten a very rare building permit to rebuild it. But the difficulty is if the settlers see
They
them
being the
rebuilding it,
Palestinians had gotten a permit to rebuild it, which is extremely
yeah,
hard in for Palestinians to get. Yep.
yeah. I think it's something like fewer than 5% of building permits are granted to Palestinians in the West Bank. Some diplomatic strings were pulled. It is a lot of work to put up what is essentially a shed. Um, and so they got permits to rebuild it. They had coordination with the police who said that they were going to like essentially protect this happening. That's fake. That didn't actually happen, but they also didn't stop it, which is something. Um, but we had to do all of this at night in order to prevent the settlers from seeing and coming and tearing it down. So I was there essentially as a white guy with a camera, because settlers prefer when these things are not documented or only documented from their perspective in very specific ways that are then used to arrest Palestinians or garner support or donations for them or what have you. So I kind of hung out by the fire while they rebuilt these things in record time. It was incredibly impressive, like all around like midnight. But then more commonly, I'll go spend the night, just kind of, especially in times when there's more risk of pogroms. Around Purim was really scary. A bunch of drunk settlers hopped up on ethno-nationalism. It's not a good time for anybody. Um, but especially around holidays, around Pesach, it kicked up. And then sometimes, seemingly at random, they will do things like create fake graves outside of Palestinian settlements as a threat. Um, like, and you don't know what's going to happen. And so you go out and hope that your presence deters settler violence. It doesn't always, but if if anything does happen, you are able to document
It. I always think of Bialik had that famous poem that people like to reference, where he said, "We'll know that Zionism has been successful when there's a Jewish police officer arresting a Jewish criminal." And it always stands out to me because I think it's hard for Americans and American Jews in particular to internalize this. But in Israel, your sociological equivalent of your crazy Christian nationalists and of your anti-government anarchists, and of every manifestation of politics and sociology and society are Jews. Um, and so the idea that it is Jews doing this for Jewish reasons is I think wild for some people to understand. Um, Okay, I want to open it up to questions. We've got about 10 minutes left. So if you are here on the webinar, click on that Q&A button on the bottom, drop in any questions that you may have for Ezra now, please. And while folks are doing that, Ezra, will you say something about your thinking for next year and what your plans for the future are, and maybe reflect on Aliyah a little bit and whatever direction you want to take?
Definitely. All right. So it does confuse people a lot when I say that I'm planning on making Aliyah. One of the things is if I have citizenship, they can't deport me. So there is a very likely eventuality that I will be arrested, one way or another, because, you know, the cops don't like protective presence people being there. The military doesn't like it. Getting arrested is something that is going to happen to me if I continue this work. In order to safeguard me continuing to do this work, Aliyah is a necessity. They also give me money, and I am poor. Um, so I would like to have that like little bit more economic support as I kind of find a job and find my stability here. And then I'm also planning on continuing this next year at Pardes. Um, to continue learning. I feel like I've just gotten started, like I kind of just dipped my toe into Aramaic, and so I want to kind of get more of a solid, you know, base in like Jewish textual learning before I kind of continue on with, whatever human rights work that I'm going to be doing day to day.
And how has your own sense of your religiosity changed over this year at Pardes and this year in Israel?
Um, it's tricky because in the US I was definitely, oh bless you, definitely a little bit like more observant, like wear wore kippah. I still wear kippah outside of Israel because I feel like it means something different inside and outside of Israel. Um, Inside of Israel, it leads to assumptions about my politics that are just deeply wrong. Um, the security guards who also, I'm definitely on some kind of watch list because I got put through the ringer with LL security. But they decided that I was Dati based on the way I was dressed, national religious, which is not what's happening here at all. Um, versus outside, it just means Jewish or something. Um, and I feel like I've gotten a lot more secure in my lack of observance, and I've definitely found kind of a comfortable middle ground. Like I'm still doing, Friday night dinner at somebody's house every week. We're saying Kiddush. And then the next morning I'm gonna like watch my little shows. Um, so finding a way to be like very Jewishly involved and not exactly observant has been a huge benefit of being in Jerusalem.
Yeah, this is sort of what Aleph Bet Yoshua meant when he famously gave a speech to the National Conference of American Jewish Federations. And he got up in front of everyone and said, a Palestinian shopkeeper is more Jewish than the most observant one of you people here, because they're living the fullness of Jewish life. And he was not very popular, obviously, at the Federation when he gave this. Um, but there is a richness and a depth to Jewish life which is not dependent on observance and religiosity or personal observance and religiosity in Israel that is just really kind of impossible outside of Israel, I think. Um, okay, any last thoughts, any questions from anyone? We had no questions today. We had one person ask, oh, hold on, question popped up. Ezra, if the trend in every Israeli election is edging further to the right, do you have much hope that the tide can ever be turned toward more tolerance towards the Palestinians? From John Reamer.
Um, that is a big question that I am not even a little bit equipped to answer. I'm hoping that things will turn a little bit more left, like Bibi's sheer incompetence and willingness to hold on to power at any cost to everybody else around him, I'm hoping will kind of wake some people up about the direction that I think that we need to go. I'm hoping that the like pro hostage movements edging toward the anti-war protests will kind of bring us in that direction. Um, I have hope that the tide is going to turn, but I can't give like a very coherent political analysis beyond that.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, we're getting all sorts of questions popping in. Okay, here we go. An introduction just saying wonderful things about you, Ezra, and then a question. Most societies have a vibrant right and a left population is able to regulate itself internally. Do you see a left equivalent on the Palestinian side? And I also want to note that there is no meaningful political left in Israel right now, in the Jewish community. But if you want
Sorry, can you say the question again?
to say that, Ezra, sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Question is, do you see a left equivalent amongst the Palestinians? And I'm going to expand that question to, does a meaningful left exist or can it exist amongst Israelis too, Jewish Israelis?
Okay. So I do not know much about Palestinian like political life. I'm not able to engage in the way that I would want, and also like I'm hanging out with sheep farmers, so I can't really like give you the down low on what's happening in like Ramallah. Um, but I can say that I think that there is a possibility of a meaningful Israeli left. I think that it is growing. Like some young people are, yes, going further to the right and saying, yes, there was a Nakba and we should have done it better. But I feel like there is also a more meaningful population that is learning about the Nakba at a younger age, as more and more Israelis are, very fluent in English at a younger age, which didn't used to be the case, and I think are learning about the Nakba and saying we should not have done that, and I think are taking meaningful steps toward understanding a future that is, livable for everybody.
From Robert Fishbone. Do Israelis worry, I'm rewording this question just a little bit, or there must much conversation within Israel about the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who may want revenge? Uh, I'll expand this to my own political analysis, which is that I have never understood how this war is doing anything other than just increasing the ranks of Hamas a decade from now.
Oh yeah.
But what does that sound like in Israel? Are there either public Israeli concern about the medium to long-term strategic implications here?
So I feel like a lot of people who are pro-war and think that this is a good idea already understand Palestinians as essentially like thoughtless, bloodthirsty monsters. They're not really attributing any sort of like rational thought to Palestinians. They're essentially, especially not attributing any sort of rational thought to somebody who ends up joining Hamas, which can happen for any number of reasons. Um, and then I think the people who are, anti-war and see this as creating, Hamas class of, 2035, um, understand that a little bit better, but aren't in the position of power to kind of make the changes fast as it needs to happen to prevent that.
Thank you. From Gloria Morgenstern, if you could speak to a young pro-Palestinian demonstrator, presumably we're talking about in the US, on a college campus, how might you share what sounds like your experience of seeing a very different perspective on what Israel is and what's happening than I think the framing most of these college students have?
That's tricky. Because in my experience as a, late teens, early 20 somethings protester, listening to more nuanced perspectives was not so much like on the docket, if I'm completely honest.
I love how you
Um,
keep bringing up the reminder that these are kids, right? It's so important to remember that these are kids. Yep. Mhm.
like these are children. And also it is children in combat right now. Like you go into the IDF when you're 18 and are usually, if you're a combat soldier, you're in there for 3 years. These are 18 to 20-year-olds on all sides of this. Um, and I think I would encourage people to consider that these are just people who were born here. Like, and I think encouraging people to kind of just understand the humanity of people who are here, because I feel like that gets lost as a political talking point, when in fact, like, I'm just some guy who wanted to study Talmud in Jerusalem.
Nice.
Like, I'm not a boogeyman.
Well, not for that reason. Okay, last question. How do Israelis honor the concept of the value of life when so many innocent people are being killed daily?
It's kind of difficult to say because I feel like when you are born into a difficult security situation, you are essentially told your entire life that it's either you or them. The lives that most people are worried about are not Palestinians. They are worried about Israeli lives because they understand this as a zero-sum game. Um, so I think that I feel like everybody could use some humanity in this, and understanding that these are people, largely teenagers and early 20 somethings on every side of this, um, living their lives and doing their best.
Amen.
I think that's just kind of, yeah, it gets lost when you are born into this difficult security situation and told that the IDF is saving you every day.
Well, Ezra, thank you. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for your wisdom and your perspective. You weren't originally going to be the first of our sessions, but I'm really glad that you were the first of our sessions. Uh, and actually, it's going to work out. Again, this is entirely accidental, but I think you are going to be our most left-wing perspective. Next week, we are going to get the person who was sort of the dorm mom of Hebrew Union College for generations of rabbinical students, now rabbis, and just a very close friend of Karen and myself. In fact, 2 weeks after we started dating, when I was going to go break up with Kara, and she convinced me not to. So we give lots of credit to her, but also just a very interesting perspective. Nancy will be on next week. And then the week after that, we'll be there at my Moroccan Israeli daughter of refugee settler working in Arab integration coexistence. All the various things that make sense in Israel and don't make sense outside of Israel, I think, how they could sit together. So Ezra, thank you for kicking us off. For those who have been a part of this today, if you would like to support programs like this or support this program, donations to my discretionary fund help to fund this. We're going to send a little honorarium to Ezra and to our other speakers. So just thank you, everyone. This was an interesting, engaging, growth-filled experience, and we'll see you all in a week.
Thank you so much for having me.
There's a bazillion notes of how much people love you, Ezra, and miss you, by the way, if you're not seeing those from your phone.
That's so sweet. Thank you, everyone.